Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to cover the latest news about the oil and gas industry and mineral rights and royalties for October of 2025. Justin, we are officially here as far as this episode is concerned in the fourth quarter, and the end of the year is fast approaching.
Hard to believe. Time goes so fast.
It goes very fast, and there's some interesting articles this month that I would say are a little bit different than what we've talked about in the past. So, it's been maybe a little bit of a slow news month from a minerals and royalties perspective, but from the overall energy point of view, it's been very dynamic, and there are some really interesting developments occurring.
You said it, Matt. And, we've talked about energy poverty. We've talked about developing nations and how important energy is. And our stories just kind of speak to that. We're always looking for what's next in energy, what has a higher concentration that we can access. And these are a lot of pretty interesting sources and things going on, some of them that are currently happening and some that may be the future.
Yeah. So on that note, do you want to talk about this first article here?
Let's do it. So the first one's about astro mining. So the quadrillion-dollar resource race. NASA's Psyche mission is en route to a metal-rich asteroid aiming to understand its composition, while U.S. startups are actively developing technologies for asteroid mining. Asteroids hold quadrillions of dollars worth of precious metals like platinum, gold, iron, and offer a potential revolution to global supply chains for critical minerals. Commercial asteroid mining faces challenges, I think that's pretty obvious, including in the risk of market oversaturation and price collapse. And companies like TransAstra are refining new extraction techniques. And Matt, this has really been going on for quite a while. There's been companies that have been researching this and looking at technologies, much like going to space, going to Mars. It's kind of a niche in a market where people are already looking into the future on this.
Yeah, it's like they say, space is the final frontier. And, the articles talking about the next mission to the moon, I think they just announced the astronauts that are candidates to go on that Artemis mission, which actually is just in a couple of years from now. So we're actually kind of refocusing back on space as a place to colonize, to explore again, starting with the moon, then Mars, and other places beyond that. And, certainly the interesting thing about this asteroid mining is that the numbers that they're talking about, quadrillions of dollars, and that is just hard to put your mind around. And the quote says, NASA's estimates suggest mining just 10 such bodies, and they're talking about asteroids, could generate $100 million per Earth resident, totaling $1.5 trillion. That doesn't seem to add up, those numbers, but I'm sure that the quadrillion number, if you get to that point and you divide by the 8 billion people on the planet, it's a lot of money, and it could be something that could really disrupt the mining industry. And I can see and hear how they're talking about they want to avoid the risk of oversaturating the market and, causing the prices of valuable precious metals like platinum, gold, et cetera, to just crater, because that would have a very significant impact on the global economy. So, they need to do it in a mindful way. And then the other question in my mind is, who actually owns these asteroids? Who gets to get the royalties from these, right? So is it something that it's every country on the planet should share in, or is it just that, a company can go out into space and harvest this and not have to pay any royalties to a government or to people or what have you? So that's a really interesting, concept that, I'm sure will get tested as this gets closer to becoming reality. It seems right now this is still in the kind of initial phase of understanding the potential there, with this NASA mission. So no company is eminently, going to be mining for gold or platinum on these asteroids, but, pretty interesting. And these, from a physics or from an astronomy point of view, there's the Arizona State University, Lindy Elkins Tanton has a quote in here about where these are from and what it is. And basically, these are believed to be the exposed core of an ancient protoplanet. So basically, think of a planet that was forming and all these materials, clumped together in space and were kind of hurling through space. And that's kind of what they are. So it's really interesting. We think it's like the core of a planet. this metallic core. So the earth itself has a metallic core that probably has a lot of these same elements in them and minerals in them. And, it could be really valuable as well. Obviously, we can't really mine the core of our planet. And so you go to these things that are floating through space. So really interesting article here.
Yeah, an interesting technology being developed with this. I mean, there's really some interesting thing going on. They're learning how to mine completely with what it mentions in the article, that it uses concentrated solar energy to process water-laden asteroids. I'm sure this technology has taken a long time to develop.
Yeah, and before we hit record, we were talking about some of the other developments in mining, with this whole push to mine critical minerals and try to get something up and running quickly. There are a few companies that are exploring how to mine the seafloor for these metallic nodules that contain high levels of those critical minerals and things required for, electric motors and batteries and so forth. And so I think that'll probably be the next frontier when we think about expanding beyond, land mining, that mining the seafloor where they know where these nodules are. They just need to suck them up and then take them to a processing ship. And so it's just, I think right now they're in the process of raising capital and putting the plans together and kind of getting the technology up and running so that they can scale this up. So that is probably where we're going to see more activity. And again, similar concept is you want to be careful. You're not going to oversaturate the market and cause prices to collapse, which would, shoot yourself in the foot from that standpoint. But really interesting stuff going on in companies that are kind of branching out from the traditional mining that we're used to.
Yeah, you said it, man. Yeah, with the deep sea, there are already a lot of conversations going on about who owns this, how does it get split, which is a good sign. It'd be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, our next one, Matt, is about New Mexico. So the governor is touting the new lower methane numbers, but the state's still falling short on the 2030 climate goal. Matt, the political winds in New Mexico, it's been a lot of talking and limiting of oil and gas, which can be a bit ironic for New Mexico because they depend on it so much for their state. And New Mexico's stricter methane rules for oil and gas company means the state's emissions are half the releases from the neighboring Texas. And it goes on to say that the satellite data showed 1.2% of natural gas escaping in the atmosphere relative to the total amount sold in New Mexico compared to 3.1% in Texas. So they are seeing a reduction there. Matt, I wonder what the impact is on the oil and gas industry and how much more expensive it is to do business there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's more expensive. You think about the regulations, they're certainly more restrictive in New Mexico than they are in Texas, just across the border, both in the Permian, greater Permian Basin. Interestingly, that number that they quote as far as production of natural gas, you wonder, and the emissions of natural gas, you wonder what the difference is in terms of the production. So they may emit half, but what do they produce relative to Texas? And in 2023, the top 5 largest dry natural gas producing states were Texas was number 1 at 9.75 TCF, that's trillion cubic feet, which is 25.8% of the U.S. Dry gas production share. And New Mexico is number 5 at 2.89 TCF or 7.6%. So I wonder if you were to normalize it based on the amount that those states are producing, it probably isn't quite as impressive, as the governor is touting, which, I guess isn't that surprising since, from a political standpoint, they want to talk about all the good things that are happening in the state from an environmental standpoint. But yeah, it's interesting, when you look at it that way. This article talks about the data was collected via satellite. So it basically measures or can take images and see where natural gas is escaping into the atmosphere relative to the total amount produced and sold in New Mexico. So it is actually, I guess, normalized from that standpoint. So I take back what I just said, but it's that methane intensity, which is basically that relative measure, was 1.2% in New Mexico and 3.1% in Texas. So that's good from a mineral and royalty owner perspective. You want the natural gas to remain in the pipeline because that means it gets measured and sold, and then we get royalties from that. If it gets emitted into the atmosphere, that's a lost opportunity, and it's not great for the environment, and it's not great from a royalty owner perspective because we don't get paid on any gas that isn't sold. And so, from that standpoint, it does seem that New Mexico is headed in the right direction. But again, I think it's easier to implement those types of controls when you have a smaller footprint. You have fewer wells you're having to put these sorts of controls on, and, fewer flanges and fittings and pipes that you actually have to worry about. Of course, you're going to emit less, and it's easier for companies if you do implement those regulations on new wells and things like that. If you have a smaller area that you're dealing with, it's easier to kind of get ahead of that and make more progress. Of course, West Texas in a whole and the Permian Basin is just huge, and that's where most of the activity is occurring. And so from that standpoint, the longer you wait to implement those controls, the bigger that gap is going to grow, I think, from an environmental, impact point of view, as far as natural gas is escaping, whereas Texas maybe doesn't have as stringent controls in place, and, they're not going to require them yet. And as long as that's the case, you'll see New Mexico leading the way there. So I guess kudos to New Mexico from that standpoint. And to the extent they're still allowing the industry to innovate and put those controls in place and be profitable and allow them to drill, that's a good thing. So yeah, it's just an interesting article. I don't know that I would make too much of a stink about it, just from the standpoint of a mineral and royalty owner perspective. It's not going to have a big impact on us, but other than, if they're selling more gas, it's good.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And, it's creating an industry for professionals for the methane testing. And what we've seen with a lot of these is really it comes down to ensuring that they're routinely reporting and testing this. So I'm sure that helps to bring people into the industry for a different skill set. And, that's never a bad thing. All right. So our last story here, Matt, it was pretty interesting. We were talking before we hit record. The story is an interesting story in itself, but it's even more interesting when you realize a lot of this is already going on. And the article's title here, or the article subject is West Texas wants to sell its natural gas to AI data centers, but has few options for transporting it. So big data centers that power the artificial intelligence. Big data centers that power the artificial intelligence industry demand an abundance of energy. West Texas, known for producing 40% of the nation's crude oil, also has an extraordinary amount of natural gas that could power those data centers, but the region lacks adequate infrastructure to convert the gas, a byproduct of pumping oil, into electricity and transmit it to the growing industry, experts said. And Matt, this article is really pretty interesting, talking a lot about the transport issues and how they get they basically are saying they need more pipelines. And it'll be interesting to see how this is solved. But the fact is, there are a lot of projects going on in West Texas already. So OpenAI's got a project going on. There were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 different people currently working on data centers. Some of these are already open and running. So I wonder how they are going to solve that issue or how they're handling it currently.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And West Texas is unique in that it also has an abundance of renewable energy. When I say renewable, I mean wind and solar. And so a lot of these, even though that's there, that can't be used for these data centers because they need the reliability and uptime to be very high. You're like 99% uptime. And if, the sun isn't shining and you don't have power, that's not going to work for these data centers that require that reliability. And so what it means is they're going to need to turn to other forms of power generation, and namely natural gas, because that can be scaled up very quickly. And there's an abundance of natural gas in West Texas. And so the real issue, like Justin mentioned, is really getting the gas from where it's produced at the wellhead into where these data centers are being built. And, I think it's one of those things that probably if you build it, they will come. And if you have this commitment by these companies to build these data centers, to have long-time purchase agreements for natural gas, then the midstream companies and the transport pipelines will get built. And certainly in Texas, where there's a favorable regulatory environment for those types of infrastructure projects. But I think the benefit here, and kind of something that is, you have to read between the lines when you look at this article, is from a mineral and royalty owner perspective. If you have minerals in West Texas, you're probably not getting paid very much, if anything, for the natural gas that's being produced and sold. And that's just because there's an extreme glut. In other words, they have more gas than we know what to do with, and we don't have enough pipelines to take it away to market where it can be sold for the market price, the Henry Hub price, which is basically in Louisiana. And if you look at trying to get it from A to B, from West Texas to Louisiana, there's pipelines that are being built, but they're just immediately being filled with all of the excess gas that's being produced as a byproduct of producing crude oil in the Permian Basin. And so we need to do something with that gas. If they can build data centers there to use it, then that provides additional demand that could provide a boost to the prices that are being paid for that gas, and would mean that we would get higher royalty payments for the gas that's produced and sold. So I think this is a really bullish signal for natural gas prices in West Texas. So if you have minerals and royalties in West Texas, definitely something to keep an eye on as these projects get built and come online. There certainly is a fair amount of this that's going to tap into the grid and all of those types of things. And so that'll be a big part of it. But then, there are, like this Stargate project, like Justin mentioned, which is that OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank infrastructure project that was announced with President Trump at the beginning of the year. Initial goal of investing $500 billion in these AI data centers. And this particular one, this first site in Abilene, is already operational. And they're announcing actually just this month, they just announced an expansion there with new facilities projected to draw 600 megawatts of power. And that build out includes a new 360.5 megawatt natural gas plant. So that is, a big, source of demand for that area, which is huge. And then, like Justin said, there's like 6 different articles here just in the past, couple of weeks, mostly focused on West Texas and all the things that are going on there and all the different data centers and Bitcoin mining facilities and things like that are being built just because of that excess natural gas, which means that they have low cost source of energy.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And there's just all kinds of stories going on currently about how they might handle this, from some of the data centers actually building the plants required to convert the fuels and make a gas-fired plant to serve the data center, all kinds of different issues. There are some pipeline companies who have made agreements to deliver gas to some of the infrastructure and facilities. So really quickly moving area, and interesting to see, flaring is something that's mentioned in here, that the flared gas could be used for these data centers. So it'll be interesting to see too, from a royalty standpoint for mineral owners, you wouldn't want that to be counted as flared if they're selling it to these data centers. So interesting things going on.
Yeah, really interesting. All right, rig count time. So we have some positive news for a change on the North American rig count and the land rigs. We are at 527, which is up 3 from a week ago. So I think, we may have reached the bottom. What do you think, Justin?
No, I agree, Matt. It's good to see that it's going up. And I thought where they're going up at is pretty interesting. So we actually we're down 1 rig in Louisiana, 2 rigs in Texas, and then we gained 2 rigs in Wyoming. Matt, do you read that as a focus on oil and, trying the natural gas issue that's going on already?
Yeah, I imagine, it does look like the DJ Basin, which is primarily oil with a fair amount of natural gas liquids and gas. They picked up 2 rigs. The Granite Wash picked up 1. But yeah, Wyoming, that covers Colorado, or the DJ Basin covers Colorado and Wyoming, and there's 4 between Colorado and Wyoming. So I think the other 2 in Wyoming are probably the Powder River Basin, which isn't mentioned specifically in this report, but that, is primarily an oil play as well. So yeah, it's interesting because gas has definitely come down a little bit over the past several weeks. And, as we're recording this, we're down to about $2.85 per 1,000 cubic feet, which is, probably down about 3% over the past month or so. Not that would be a huge difference at this point in the spending decisions they've already made, but it's good to see that we've kind of hit that bottom, at least for now, as long as oil stays where it's at. It's up today to about $65 per barrel, which is great. So yeah, hopefully that uptick continues to be the mode of operation here. Yeah,
you said about, and hopefully we'll see natural gas prices kind of even out and go up a bit as these data centers help to even out the supply and demand issues, because takeaway capacity has been an issue in the Permian Basin for a long time now.
Yeah, it really has. So good things on the future, I think, and good things on the horizon. Lots of opportunity out there still in the oil and gas space, and minerals and royalties in West Texas is obviously the hotbed of activity. But then, you wonder some of these things that are developing. We typically are focused on oil and gas as kind of the primary area of interest, just because that's where most of us receive royalty payments on. But, you wonder from a business standpoint, for sure, there's some of these business opportunities to get involved or invest in companies that are doing things like asteroid mining or deep sea mining. And so that's kind of an interesting area that's just totally new industries are being stood up. right now, which is not very common.
Yeah, you said it, man. And we were talking a bit before we hit record with these data centers, companies like Eaton, companies that build infrastructure, electrical companies. I'm sure this is all having a huge impact on their bottom line as well, because this is a whole new source of supply, a whole new demand of electricity that, if we were talking 10 years ago, it really wasn't even on the horizon.
Yeah, it wasn't on the horizon at all. And, obviously the one that gets the most press is NVIDIA, because they make the chips that go into these graphics cards or GPUs that they use for the processing. And so this is a huge boom for them. And obviously their stock price has reflected that over the past couple of years. But yeah, lots of companies, I think if you dig a little bit deeper, and obviously this shouldn't be construed as investment advice, but kind of an interesting area to be monitoring at this point. All right, well, that wraps up this month's news episode. Again, if you have an article that you come across you'd like us to cover in a future episode, you can send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Or if you have a question, just send us an email as well. And as always, we'll put links to these articles and to the other episodes and resources mentioned in the show notes, which can be found at mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.